So what I'm hearing you say is that from a kind of demeaning of black women as basically apolitical or not part of the sort of normal structure of politics, we've now moved, or would I be correct in saying that we've now moved to where black women are central in a way to articulating some of the big political issues of our moment?
Sure, I think that's accurate. I mean, I think that recent data bears that out. So we know with the 2016 presidential election that, and also in prior elections, the data is suggesting that, you know, where black women go and vote, so goes the Democratic Party. So black women are, you know, involved in participation in local electoral politics, things such as school boards to, you know, grassroots work like working at polling stations. You know, black women have become, certainly in the last few decades, really powerful political figures. And, you know, one can, I think, wonderfully draw a line from a figure like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper, who, you know, a leader of the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, really was creating a space for the first time for black women in electoral politics, to someone like Stacey Abrams, who's, you know, now running for governor of the state of Georgia and would be the first black woman governor. So we can imagine black women forerunners, right? People like Shirley Chisholm, a Democrat here in New York City, who sort of slowly opened up this space such that it's now become almost overdetermined that black women will have these sort of political roles in American life.
And do you attribute that to a kind of racial coming together, black and white, or do you attribute that to a gendered result? That is, if you were to look at what black women are doing now, would you say that that's a consequence of the fact that women have taken that all kinds of women have taken ever greater roles in our society? Or would you attribute it to the fact that we're certainly not a post-racial society, but we are racially somewhat, at least some of us are racially more you know, sort of accepting of a multicultural society than we were in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, of course it's both, right? Of course it's the case that coming from African American communities where what the vote meant and what the franchise meant for African Americans who had been long denied it, well after, you know, women, the category of women received the ability to vote. It was the case that black women were excluded from voting through all sorts of means, poll taxes, and
black women and men.
And men, yes. So, you know, so there's certainly a role that race plays there, but it's also the case that we've slowly been able to imagine, you know, all sorts of women variously in leadership, although I think whether or not we will have a woman president soon, you know, remains to be seen. And I think that it's certainly the case that some of the reaction to the Hillary Clinton candidacy was about an inability to imagine a woman in such a role.
But let me push you a little bit on this. When Shirley Chisholm ran for president in 1972, she was asked whether it was race or sex that was the most significant issue, and she replied that it was sex that had pushed her into doing this, or sexual discrimination. Would you agree with her then and now?
Actually, I wouldn't have agreed with her then, although I probably would have been afraid to say so to the one Shirley Chisholm. But I think that, you know, I think I'm of a generation, both as a citizen and as a scholar, that really understands these things to be inextricably linked. And so I really don't think that that binary is useful for understanding the experiences, not only of black women, just of women more generally. Right? That there are various sort of social historical contributions that come with people into certain social roles and subject positions that are pretty important. And certainly there can be moments of more emphasis, right? So if you're an African American woman, you know, in an organization of women, let's say, you know, I think, you know, race sort of comes to the fore in the experience of that. But even in that instance, it's the case that it is the intersection of those things that is present.
So talk to us a little bit about intersectionality and how this concept of intersectionality has helped to move not just the intellectual process, we know academics have been using the term for a while, but now the political process.
Yes, it's been fascinating to watch, and I do hope that there's some, you know, sort of essay or, you know, or documentary that will sort of track this. You know, so intersectionality is a term that comes to us from Kimberly Crenshaw, I believe in 1988, her essay Mapping the Margins, and a law review essay. And it was really the embodiment of what Black feminists had been saying in some ways for generations, right? So you have early figures in Black feminist thought who are writing about you know, double jeopardy, Black women being both women and, you know, and African American, and sort of being at risk for double jeopardy in American society, triple jeopardy, you know, also being disproportionately poor, right, and sort of creating certain conditions for Black women's experiences, Black communities' experiences, and so. You know, what Kimberly Crenshaw was able to do is showed why this mattered, right? So we went from having a kind of descriptive analytic, right? This is a different experience, to really playing out how that matters in the world. And so this powerful essay, Mapping the Margins, is about women who are subjected to domestic and other forms of violence, and the inability of the court to sort of be able to deal with that because they didn't understand. They sort of had one category, we might say. They had the category of women, and those who had different citizenship statuses, those who were not native born, those who were women of color, sort of fell out or between the cracks of the kind of liberal individual, very much assumed to be a male liberal individual of the law, the sort of primary subject of the law. So, you know, she had a very specific, Professor Crenshaw, kind of moment and case and, you know, case study in mind. And, you know, that extended into the academy out of this foundation of these earlier Black feminist thinkers, right? So, you know, I think that the conditions of possibility were created by generations of work that preceded it. And she was able to really capture and I think operationalize in ways that hadn't been possible before this really powerful concept. So then we have the sort of political scene. So we have, you know, young people over the last several decades who are, you know, educated to understand that, you know, that binary, are you a woman, are you a Black woman, are you African American, or are you a woman, doesn't quite reflect the experiences of women of color variously. And so then it becomes, I think, part of a way that people imagine themselves, right? It becomes a way that people can talk about themselves for the first time. Because certainly, you know, something like triple jeopardy didn't roll off the tongue as a way of thinking about oneself and one experience. And so, so intersectionality has become part of how, you know, not only African American women, but, you know, Americans more generally come to think of themselves. And at its best, it's really about acknowledging the, you know, unique and different subject positions that we all bring. You know, each of us come of this sort of cauldron of experiences that we bring to any encounter or to any kind of social status or social experience. And at its best, it's about acknowledging that. And you know, certainly as it's been taken up in contemporary political discourse, it's become, you know, a useful vehicle for talking about both what makes us all the same and also the things that we should attend to because they're distinctive in political discourse.